How does two Boeing 747s collide into each other on a runway? That's the question people were asking on a spring day in 1977, when a Pan Am and KLM 747, both filled with passengers, crashed almost head-on on a runway in Tenerife. A culmination of pilot error, miscommunication, bad weather, and even terrorism led to the deadliest aviation incident in history, which left a total of 583 dead. Flight 1736, a Pan American flight, left Los Angeles on March 26, 1977. Flight 1736 is a long marathon of a flight which had originated in Los Angeles, however stopped over in New York to pick up passengers and a new crew. The plane would continue on overnight into March 27th, heading to its destination. Pan Am often named their planes. This particular 747 was named Clipper Victor. Leaving New York, Flight 1736 is carrying a total of 396 passengers and crew, most of whom originated in California and are of retirement age. There is a crew of 3 piloting this plane: Captain Victor Grubbs, age 56, First Officer Robert Bragg, age 39, and Flight Engineer George Warnes, age 46. The plane they are flying is also of historical note. This very 747 flew the type's inaugural flight in 1970. This plane was also the very first 747 to face being hijacked just a few months into its service. Their destination is the island of Gran Canaria, a part of the Canary Islands archipelago known for attracting tourists. Although a short hop from the African continent, these islands officially belong to Spain, but the Canaries are still around 1 hour's flying time away from the mainland. In the mid to late 1970s, Spain was going through a massive political upheaval. 15 months earlier, the Spanish fascist dictator Francisco Franco died. Shortly before his death, he restored the Spanish monarchy, which sought to redirect Spain in a direction of democracy. Some groups saw the radical change in politics as opportunity. The Canary Islands independence movement had their own plans set in motion for March 27, 1977. The airport on Gran Canaria, sometimes known as the Las Palmas Airport or Gondo Airport, is the largest airport on the entire archipelago. The island attracts a large amount of tourists, which brings bigger planes. Gran Canaria Airport in 1977 is the only airport in the Canaries that can properly cater for a multitude of 747 aircraft at once. Another plane heading to Gran Canaria on the day is KLM Flight 4805 from Amsterdam. This 747 is one of the newer 200 models of the plane, carrying a total of 248 passengers and crew. The KLM crew, like the Pan Am crew, is also highly experienced. Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten is 50 years old and is a senior captain at KLM. For the sake of brevity, despite his full family name being Veldhuizen van Zanten, we'll be shortening this to simply Captain van Zanten going forward. His other crew members on board are First Officer Klaas Meurs, age 42, and Flight Engineer William Schroeder, age 48. This would be a totally normal flight crew if it were not for the peculiar media interest surrounding Captain Van Zanten. He is the face of many promotional materials and advertisements used by KLM to promote the airline. He is such a senior member at KLM that he is also an instructor on the plane and doesn't fly as often as his peers. Both 747s, among several other planes, are scheduled to land at Gran Canaria Airport. Whilst in the air, the Canary Islands independence movement begin implementing their plan to carry out a terrorist attack on the airport there. The Canary Islands independence movement have planned to plant 2 bombs in the terminal. At around 1 p.m, the airport received an anonymous telephone call to inform them that a bomb had been planted in the terminal. At 1:15 p.m, one of the bombs exploded, injuring 8 people in the process. As a result, the authorities temporarily closed the airport for the next few hours, meaning all incoming traffic had to divert to other airports. The Pan Am plane inbound for Gran Canaria had taken on plenty of fuel in their layover in New York. They have enough fuel to stay in a holding pattern for up to 2 hours, however they are asked by ATC to land anyway. The KLM plane is also told to land. All the islands in the Canaries have running airports, however many are unequipped to handle larger planes. All flights heading into Gran Canaria have now been diverted to the next island over in Tenerife. despite the airports on the islands of Lanzarote and Fuerteventura also being open, which are airports that are also not subjected to the possible rapid change in weather at Tenerife. In the modern day, Tenerife has two airports, the older northern Los Rodeos Airport and the newer southern Reina Sofia Airport. However, in 1977, this much larger, newer airport in the south was only under construction, and Los Rodeos Airport was the only airport on the island and is a lot smaller. This airport at the time was only a regional island airport, meant to connect the residents of the island with a bigger airport like Gran Canaria or Madrid. Los Rodeos does not normally see this level of traffic and these large airliners. A total of 5 larger airliners have been scheduled to land at Los Rodeos, on top of several smaller planes, among them both Pan Am Flight 1736 and KLM 4805. The day is Sunday, and expecting there to be fewer planes than normal, there are only 2 controllers on duty in the control tower. Here is a rough detailing of the airport layout at Los Rodeos. There is a single runway marked runway 12 on the west side and runway 30 on the east side. Taxiway Romeo runs parallel for the entire length of the runway, with the main airport apron along with the terminal more on the west side of the airport. Aside from the entrance and exits at each end of the runway, there are 4 more taxiways leading on and off the runway, and 1977 marked as Charlie 1 through 4. It's a simple airport design, yet effective for their current day-to-day operations. The size of these planes and the excessive traffic have taken up so much space on the airport's apron that there simply isn't enough room to accommodate all the planes, and so other planes have to be parked on Taxiway Romeo. For the next few hours, several planes just sat there on the tarmac at Los Rodeos Airport. The passengers on board the KLM plane disembarked into the terminal during the delay. Interesting to note that one occupant on board the flight actually lived in Tenerife. A tour guide, Rabina van Landschot, seen it as unpractical to have to travel to Gran Canaria only to travel back to Tenerife, decided to stay on the island. She had left the airport against what KLM staff advised and did not re-embark the plane to spend more time with her boyfriend who also lives on the island. Los Rodeos Airport is located high up in the northern part of Tenerife and sits on a plateau. The location of this airport makes it prone to rapid changes in weather and visibility. On this day, the weather begins to change and the visibility begins to slowly decrease. During this time on the ground, the KLM crew discussed their return journey back to Amsterdam once leaving the Canaries. KLM have a strict rule on just how long a crew can be working for. The total travel time compounded by the diversion and delay into Tenerife could put their plans in jeopardy. In wanting to make up some time once they get to Gran Canaria, Captain Van Zanten orders the refueling of his plane here in Tenerife, speculating that other planes will want to refuel in Gran Canaria. He has decided to get ahead and refuel here to get ahead of time. He takes on enough fuel for the small trip over to the other island and for the entire trip back to Amsterdam plus contingency flying time. The airport at Gran Canaria reopens later in the day, and the ATC at Tenerife set about trying to get all of their planes out of the airport. As it stands, the Pan Am plane is currently stuck behind the KLM plane, which is at the front of the queue on the west side of the runway. There isn't enough room to safely pass the KLM plane, and so the whole airport is held up in a delay for longer until the KLM plane has finished refueling. Another delay is added as 4 other passengers who should have already reboarded the KLM flight have not returned to the plane. By this time, a thick fog begins to envelop the airport, visibility begins to drop. Soon those in the control tower cannot see the other end of the runway due to the poor visibility. The plan of action to get the 2 largest planes out of the airport, the KLM and Pan Am, was as follows. The KLM plane would enter runway 12. Due to winds, it is unsafe at such a small airport to take off with a tailwind. They must depart in the opposite direction. The plan was to have the KLM plane backtrack the full length of the runway, turn and hold position on runway 30 until clearance for takeoff was received. Meanwhile, the Pan Am plane would also backtrack the runway but vacating via the Charlie 4 taxiway onto Romeo, where they would continue their taxi to the end of the runway, allowing for a more efficient departure of the 2 largest planes currently still at the airport. The air traffic controller working explained to the Pan Am crew that once they entered the runway, they are to leave the runway on the third exit. A communication error left the Pan Am crew uncertain as to what the controller said. Did he say the first or third exit? They double-checked with the controller, to which they clarified the third exit. Looking over some of the airport charts during their taxi down the runway, there is some confusion in the cockpit. The third exit would seem to indicate Charlie 3, however this is clearly an unsuitable exit for the plane. However, the following exit, Charlie 4, does seem to be perfectly reasonable, as it is a higher speed exit at an appropriate angle. A study by the Airline Pilots Association concluded that such sharp turns in the 747 would be practically impossible on these runways and taxiways. The Pan Am flight crew in low visibility did not see Charlie 3 as they passed it and continued down towards Charlie 4. During all of this, the controller on duty is also trying to juggle the KLM plane as well. Once the KLM plane was in position at the end of the runway, facing down in the reciprocal direction on runway 30, Captain Van Zanten, without any authorization to take off, begins to power up his plane until First Officer Class Mers reminds him that he needs clearance first. The KLM flight needs to get ATC clearance to fly the route out of their airspace at Tenerife. The controller then sends the clearance to the KLM crew. Note that this is only clearance to fly the route, not takeoff clearance, which is separate. They are to wait until the Pan Am plane has vacated the runway, to which then the controller will give takeoff clearance. Despite this, Captain Van Zanten throttles up his plane anyway. A lot goes on in these few seconds, so let's break this down. KLM First Officer Class Mers signs off his clearance message with, "We are ready at takeoff." The controller at Tenerife replies with the following message, "Stand by for takeoff." However, interrupting this message from the controller was the Pan Am First Officer Robert Bragg with a very stern, "No, we are still taxiing down the runway." Despite this, perhaps in a communication error, KLM Captain Van Zanten continues his takeoff roll down the runway. The tower then replies to the Pan Am's message to report runway clear. Thinking they are in the OK to continue their taxi unabated, Pan Am First Officer Robert Bragg simply replies with, "Report runway clear." On board the KLM plane, the First Officer swiftly tries to remind Captain Van Zanten that he needs to wait for the Pan Am plane to clear the runway, quoting, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" To which Captain Van Zanten retorts, "Oh yes." KLM Flight 4805 is now powering down the runway even once the Pan Am plane has said over frequency that they are still on the same runway. Both planes are now facing head-on with the KLM plane accelerating. Due to the poor visibility, the control tower cannot see the planes. Neither plane has been able to see each other until from both perspectives, the glow of the landing lights from the opposing plane slowly comes into view. Captain Van Zanten suddenly realizes that his plane is heading straight for the Pan Am 747. He pulls back on his control column in a desperate attempt to get his plane to fly. He took the decision earlier to load up 55 tons of fuel. The added weight means that he now needed a longer takeoff roll than if he hadn't took on the fuel. His plane can't climb, but his nose slowly begins to rise, while his tail section scrapes the runway. Back on board the Pan Am plane, once Captain Victor Grubbs sees the KLM 747 coming towards his plane, he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. In an instant, he applies full throttle to his engines and desperately begins to turn his plane to the left onto the Charlie 4 taxiway. The Pan Am slowly begins to turn. However, at 6 minutes past 5 in the evening, the KLM flight did manage to briefly get airborne, but not before its underside struck the top of the Pan Am plane. The right wing and engine demolished the entire cabin of the hump of the Pan Am 747, while the KLM fuselage tore through the Pan Am's body. Remaining airborne for a few more seconds, the KLM 747 comes back down and crashes much further down the runway, engulfed in flames, killing all 284 occupants on board. All the while, the Pan Am plane continues to burn on the ground. Passengers and flight attendants begin to flee the flaming wreckage of the plane. The whole Pan Am flight crew survived, however sadly 335 of the 396 occupants perished, leaving a total of 61 survivors from not only the Pan Am but also both planes. 62 if you want to count Rubina van Landshot, who left the airport in Tenerife without reboarding the KLM plane. Immediately after the crash, those in the control tower due to low visibility could not easily see that two planes had just crashed on their runway. It took another plane that was flying above the airport to report back to the tower that they could see smoke and fire on the ground. It took 20 minutes for fire and rescue teams to reach the Pan Am plane. The initial response reached the KLM crash site first and could not see further down the runway that the Pan Am 747 was still burning with people trying to escape the wreckage. In the aftermath, a lot of the blame came down on Captain Van Zanten's decision to take off without the appropriate clearance from ATC. Why was he so eager to get off the ground? His impatience cost the lives of 583 people. Captain Van Zanten was not only a KLM captain, he was the chief airline pilot. He had more management responsibilities than other captains at the airline. Knowing the strict rules on duty time at the airline, which he is not allowed to exceed, he knew he needed to get going to remain ahead of that time. The diversion to Tenerife may have been a delay, but he may have also feared that the weather at Tenerife would continue to deteriorate by the minute. Had the weather continued to worsen, he may have feared that he wouldn't have been able to take off at all. This would not only cost time but also a lot of money and resources to lay over all the passengers and crew in hotels overnight. The plane would be sitting on an airfield it shouldn't even be at, removing it from KLM's active fleet of planes, making it unavailable for other services. Things wouldn't have went over well at head office. All of the variables from throughout the day, the terrorist attack at Gran Canaria Airport, the diversion of several large airliners to a much smaller airport, the decision to take on more weight in the form of fuel, the degrading weather situation, and a miscommunication between the planes and control tower all compounded against Captain Van Zanten's impatience to get flying, resulting in the deadliest aviation incident in history. The professionals investigating the incident cited Captain Van Zanten's actions as the primary cause of the crash, as all other variables were unavoidable or coincidental from those on the ground in the moment. In the wake of the Tenerife airport disaster, cockpit crew members under the captain were given more authority in the cockpit. Crew resource management became a core philosophy of the skies. Captains are now to encourage other crew members and given more input in the flight deck. The power dynamic of old has been replaced with a more democratic structure of authority. Despite this, runway incursions still occur. In 1991, a plane on approach to Los Angeles effectively squished a smaller plane on landing, killing 35 people. A very lucky escape occurred in 1999 in Chicago, when a Korean Airlines 747 nearly collided with another plane on takeoff. In that instant, the Korean plane was able to climb away but was far too close for comfort. These incursions have still continued to occur on occasion, even as recently as 2016, when an incursion in Shanghai in China could have left hundreds dead at Hongqiao Airport. Technology has been catching up. In the last 30 years, radar has become more sophisticated. Controllers can now electronically see the position of all planes at an airport with the right equipment. Technology exists that even the avid aviation enthusiast can monitor almost any runway in the world from their smartphone. Nearly 45 years later, Tenerife remains as the deadliest aviation incident ever.